In the quiet aftermath of Queen Elizabeth II's passing, a sealed envelope changed everything. Tucked away from public view was a hidden clause in Her Majesty's private will, one that no one expected, least of all Sarah Ferguson. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For weeks, the world had assumed the formal reading of the Queen's will brought closure. It had been broadcast, dissected, and speculated upon by royal experts, loyalists, and media outlets across the globe. But behind the palace walls, a second document sat in silence, untouched, undisclosed, and known only to a select few. This private testament, sealed in the Queen's personal handwriting, carried a single explosive revelation. Princess Beatrice, not Sarah Ferguson, would inherit the Queen's most emotionally significant personal items. Jewelry pieces that had never graced the public's gaze. Items rumoured to be entwined with memories, heartbreak, and history. When word of this second will began to circulate among senior royal aides, there was a pause followed by a deep and growing unease. This decision wasn't just unexpected, it defied generations of assumed inheritance etiquette and cast a shadow over what had once seemed a settled matter. Sarah Ferguson had long believed that her loyalty would be remembered, that her years of public restraint, her quiet devotion to the Queen's comfort, and her nurturing of the monarch's beloved corgis would mean something, that the bond she had quietly rebuilt with Her Majesty over the years would bear fruit not in title or influence, but in a quiet acknowledgement of trust. Yet when the sealed letter was finally revealed to those within the Windsor inner circle, her name was nowhere to be found. The document clearly and unequivocally granted specific items described only as personal and private to Beatrice. And perhaps most painfully of all, Beatrice herself had no idea this was coming. She had walked into a formal meeting at Windsor Castle, expecting routine estate matters, only to leave stunned, holding an envelope that carried the weight of a kingdom's secrets. In that moment, two fates split in silence, one of unexpected ascension, the other of quiet heartbreak. Within days, subtle signs of disruption appeared. Conversations shifted. Courtiers whispered. What had once been merely ceremonial took on the weight of betrayal, favoritism, and unresolved tension. For Sarah, the absence of her name wasn't just exclusion, it was erasure. For Beatrice, the gift was not a celebration, but a burden, delicate, dazzling, and filled with consequence. And for the monarchy, this revelation risked reopening wounds it could no longer afford to hide. But this wasn't just about diamonds and heirlooms, it was about legacy, loyalty, and one woman's silent expectations unraveling in the public eye. We're not just talking about necklaces or tiaras. These were the Queen's most sentimental possessions, pieces never seen in public, tied to deeply personal moments, and held in a private vault few even knew existed. Hidden beneath layers of royal ceremony and public tradition was a world only a handful had access to. While the crown jewels dazzled the world with their grandeur and history, the Queen kept a different kind of collection, smaller, quieter, but infinitely more intimate. Among them was a pearl brooch, gifted by Prince Philip on the eve of their wedding anniversary, worn only during their private moments away from the press. There was also the mysterious sapphire ring believed to have once belonged to Queen Victoria herself, passed down through whispers rather than protocols. These were not museum pieces, they were fragments of memory, emotion, and identity, and they were never meant for the display cases. They lived in a separate vault, tucked away in a private wing, accessible only to the monarch and a few most trusted aides. For decades, it was assumed they would remain with those who had witnessed their stories firsthand, Sarah Ferguson being one of them. Sarah had not only seen these items, she had shared in their meaning. She had accompanied the Queen during many of the occasions these pieces were worn. They weren't just royal artifacts, they were part of a shared history between two women navigating scandal, motherhood, and public reinvention. That's why the shock ran deeper than the headlines suggested. This wasn't about titles or wealth, it was about connection. And yet, when the decision was made, when the vault was opened and the Queen's handwritten directive was revealed, it was Beatrice's name, her daughter's name, that appeared in quiet ink, Beatrice had not even asked for them, but she had received them all the same. The symbolism was immediate and powerful. This wasn't just inheritance, it was a passing of something deeper. Historians and royal commentators called it unprecedented. Never before had such private, emotionally weighted items bypassed the expected recipient. Some suggested the Queen was sending a signal that the future of the monarchy rested not in past allegiances, but in the next generation's potential to lead with restraint, modernity, and quiet strength. Others whispered something more controversial, that the Queen had lost trust in the old guard and made a silent pivot before her passing. The jewellery wasn't just valuable, it was a message. Jewellers who were shown select photographs under strict confidentiality placed astronomical value on the collection, not merely because of the craftsmanship or rarity, but because of provenance. To own a brooch touched by both Philip and Elizabeth, to wear a ring once adored by Queen Victoria, it was to wear the beating heart of British royalty. And yet, for Beatrice, the glitter came with weight. Because for every carat of beauty, there was a fracture forming beneath. But behind the glittering gems lay an even darker truth, one that threatened to fracture already fragile family ties. For years, Sarah Ferguson walked a careful line, shunned, then welcomed, dismissed, then embraced. But through it all, one thing seemed certain: her bond with the Queen was unbreakable, or so she thought. In the quiet corridors of royal life, where loyalty is rarely rewarded and trust is earned in silence, Sarah had spent decades redeeming herself. From the scandals that nearly erased her name, to the quiet acts of devotion walking beside the Queen at Balmoral, caring for Her Majesty's beloved corgis, and never once leaking private conversations, Sarah had, in many ways, rewritten her legacy. She never asked for public acknowledgement, but behind closed doors, she clung to one thing: a belief that the Queen, in her final act, would leave her a token of that shared journey. Friends close to Sarah later revealed that she had once been told, perhaps over tea, perhaps in a whispered aside, that she would receive something personal, not a throne, not a title, but a piece of emotional significance, something that said, "You were seen, you were remembered." That belief carried her through years of public invisibility, and it was that belief that shattered when the private vault's contents were made known. Not only had Sarah's name been absent, there had been no message, no note, not even a gesture. At first, she remained silent. Not out of grace, but confusion. How could someone so present in the Queen's private life be completely omitted from this final chapter? Those closest to her say she was numb, that it wasn't about jewellery or value, it was about meaning, and the silence from the palace only deepened that wound. It didn't take long for the press to notice. A royal source mentioned an unexpected gap in the Queen's allocation of personal items. Then came the leaks. Someone from inside whispered that Sarah had expected a piece with emotional weight. But her absence from several family functions spoke volumes. Former aides, friends, even royal insiders began to give off the record interviews, painting a picture of a woman grappling not with greed but with grief, not with entitlement but with erasure. And this wasn't just emotional, it was deeply symbolic. In the royal world, where gestures carry more weight than words, the lack of any inheritance for Sarah was more than an oversight. It was a message. Whether intended or not, it reverberated. And what made it worse, what twisted the knife, was who had received the pieces Sarah had believed might one day be hers: her daughter, Beatrice. The child she had raised through scrutiny, guided through palace storms, and protected from the very institution that now held her at arm's length. And as Sarah processed what felt like a personal betrayal, Beatrice was thrust into a storm she never asked for. For Princess Beatrice, the news was not a triumph, it was a burden. The private call from the King's office changed her world in an instant. What she inherited wasn't just jewellery, it was a generational wound. It began with a simple message, an invitation cloaked in formality, delivered through the highest royal channels. No warmth, no forewarning, just a time, a place, and a name. Beatrice had assumed it was administrative, perhaps a ceremonial duty. But behind that polished protocol hid something far more personal: the Queen's private will, the one few had even known existed. And in it, a directive that placed Beatrice in the centre of a storm. She was to receive a set of items deemed by Her Majesty as personally significant. At first, Beatrice didn't grasp the full meaning, but as the pieces were named an heirloom brooch from Prince Philip, a Victorian sapphire, an embroidered locket, the weight of the moment sank in. These weren't crown jewels. These were the Queen's secrets, entrusted not to Camilla, not to Anne, but to her. Palace aides later described Beatrice as visibly shaken. This was no quiet inheritance. This was a loaded decision that challenged decades of unspoken expectations, and it had landed squarely in her lap. She turned first to her father, Prince Andrew, seeking guidance. Others suggest he was stunned into silence, unsure how to defend a daughter caught between legacy and love. Then came Eugenie, a sister's empathy, but also her own questions. Why Beatrice? Why now? Sources close to the family suggest Beatrice tried to call her mother that night. But after a brief exchange with a senior aide, she was advised against it. Let things cool down, they said. But silence, in royal life, is rarely neutral. It becomes a story of its own, and Beatrice knew this. She'd grown up watching her family's private wounds bleed into the public arena. And now, whether she wanted it or not, she had become the symbol of a royal realignment that Sarah Ferguson was never meant to witness. The days that followed were filled with tension. Every glance in the palace halls felt weighted. Every whisper carried her name. Beatrice wasn't celebrating. She was crumbling behind perfect posture and polite smiles. This wasn't honor. It was expectation, guilt, and scrutiny wrapped in velvet boxes and royal silence. She had inherited history, but not peace. And she knew all too well that once the press found out, the whispers would become a roar. But what started as a personal struggle quickly became a public battlefield when the press caught wind of the Queen's final gesture. It didn't take long. Leaked details of the Queen's private jewellery list hit the front pages, and with them came the firestorm royal loyalists, Sussex sympathisers, and scandal-hungry tabloids igniting all at once. The headlines were merciless. The Queen's final message: Beatrice over Sarah. Duchess denied. Private jewels, public betrayal. Within hours of the leak, the narrative had escaped the palace's grasp. A carefully veiled moment of inheritance became an all-out media war. Reporters unearthed old photos, rehashed historic tensions, and drew blood from decades-old wounds. Was this the Queen's deliberate signal to the monarchy? Or was it an act of quiet cruelty? Commentators didn't hesitate to choose sides. Some saw in Beatrice the future of the firm, measured, dutiful, quietly rising. Others saw Sarah as the casualty of a system that still clung to hierarchy, judgment, and shadowy decisions made behind velvet curtains. Social media turned feral. The hashtags were everywhere. Number the Queen chose Beatrice flooded timelines with tributes to a new era of female continuity. Meanwhile, number Justice for Sarah surged with emotionally charged messages, painting her as the loyal daughter-in-law wronged in her final hour. Interviews were rewatched, quotes reanalyzed. Even Sarah's past presence at Balmoral was dissected for clues. Was the Queen's silence, then, a sign? Every smile, every shared glance, was now evidence in a court of public perception. And then came the talk shows. Royal experts divided. One called it the Queen's last act of strategy. Another labelled it a personal betrayal, cloaked in royal protocol. Even the late Queen's own values were questioned. Was this truly about honour and legacy, or had old grievances, left unspoken, found a quiet way to settle themselves at last? The pressure cooker exploded when allegations from inside the palace suggested senior aides had known about the will's contents well before Beatrice herself. Rumours hinted that Sarah had been intentionally kept in the dark, perhaps out of caution, perhaps out of control. Suddenly, this wasn't just an inheritance story. It was about control, access, And who got to stand close enough to the crown when power slipped through fragile fingers? As the chaos swirled, Buckingham Palace issued a rare late-night statement. It was tight-lipped and distant. The royal family requests privacy and grace as personal matters are settled in accordance with Her Majesty's final wishes. It was neither confirmation nor denial. But in the language of royalty, it said everything. The family was splintering, and they needed the world to look away. But it wasn't just public opinion that shifted behind closed doors. Palace relationships began to rupture in ways no one could ignore. In the drawing rooms of Windsor and corridors of Balmoral, conversations turned cold. What was once an unspoken peace fractured first in glances, then in silence, then in words that couldn't be taken back. What had begun as a symbolic gesture now festered into a full-blown family rift. Private meetings were hastily arranged behind closed doors, but those meetings didn't soothe, they strained. Sources close to the palace describe a particularly tense exchange between Charles III and Beatrice, where the king is said to have issued a calm but firm warning: stay silent and stay above the noise. It wasn't advice, it was a directive. The monarchy couldn't afford emotional fallout, and Beatrice's inner turmoil was quickly becoming too visible to ignore. But how do you remain silent when the inheritance you never asked for has turned your family inside out? Princess Eugenie found herself in an impossible position. Loyal to her sister, but fiercely protective of their mother, she became the emotional bridge between two women now trapped on opposite ends of a storm neither had created. Eugenie's attempts to mediate only deepened her own anxiety. Friends close to the princess said she was completely torn, with late-night calls to Sarah marked by tears, and conversations with Beatrice met with long silences. Every word felt like a betrayal to someone. Then came the exclusions. Quiet at first. Subtle. A last-minute cancellation here, a missing name on a private guest list there. But the pattern was unmistakable. Sarah Ferguson, once cautiously reintroduced into royal circles, began to vanish from the margins of royal life again. She was absent from a recent family luncheon at Clarence House. Her invitation to a charity gala in Windsor reportedly lost in logistics. The message wasn't overt, but it was unmistakable. Something had shifted, and the doors she had once stepped through with hope were slowly beginning to close again. Behind the scenes, senior palace aides were reportedly drafting contingency plans. One royal insider described them as distancing strategies. Language that hadn't been used since the early 1992 during the fallout from Sarah's divorce from Prince Andrew. But this time, it wasn't scandal driving the narrative, it was inheritance. A quiet list of jewels had exposed deeper fractures, questions of loyalty, of trust, of worth. And in a royal house built on tradition, even unspoken doubts can echo louder than commands. For the York branch of the family, the emotional toll was immense. What should have been a moment of quiet remembrance for the Queen became a reckoning. Long-held assumptions crumbled, familial bonds frayed, and silence, once used to preserve dignity, now widened the gap between mother and daughters, father and monarch, sister and sister. What had been private heartbreak was now royal fallout. And as the House of Windsor closed ranks, the Queen's true intentions became the subject of a battle no one expected. Was this the Queen's final move on the royal chessboard? Not punishment, not favoritism, but a final, subtle act of placement. A passing of something deeper than wealth. A signal, cloaked in diamonds. In the aftermath of the chaos, when the headlines softened and the palace gates resumed their usual calm, a new narrative quietly took shape. One far removed from scandal and rivalry, one rooted in something deeper. Legacy. For royal historians, former courtiers, and those who had studied Elizabeth II, not just as a monarch, but as a strategist, the decision to pass her most private jewels to Princess Beatrice wasn't random. It wasn't sentimental. It was purposeful. To them, this wasn't about Sarah Ferguson at all. This was about the future of the monarchy and the Queen's own legacy. Beatrice, by many accounts, had always been the quiet one, loyal without loud declarations, dutiful without demanding attention. She had walked the line with grace, even as her father, Prince Andrew, became an international lightning rod. And in an institution where appearances often matter more than emotion, that composure was currency. It made her valuable, it made her safe, and perhaps, in the Queen's eyes, it made her worthy of something more than just ornament. It made her worthy of inheritance that spoke. But there was no escaping the shadow behind the decision. Sarah Ferguson's long and winding history with the Crown was filled with scandal, reconciliation, and repeated exile. While the Queen had reportedly remained fond of her former daughter-in-law in private, the institution never fully opened its doors to her again. Trust, once broken in the royal family, rarely mends completely. And when it comes to matters of legacy, the Queen was known to prioritize the continuity of the Crown above all else, even personal fondness. Sources close to Windsor, insiders suggest the jewellery wasn't just passed to Beatrice, it was assigned, symbolically, intentionally, with the weight of expectation. One aide was quoted saying the Queen saw Beatrice as a stabilizer, someone who could become a bridge between tradition and transformation, especially as the family navigated an increasingly divided public. These weren't just diamonds and sapphires. They were artifacts of trust, seals of continuity, anchors in a monarchy struggling to modernize without unraveling. And yet, not everyone agreed on the nobility of the gesture. Some argued it was emotionally cruel, an act that knowingly reopened wounds Sarah believed had long since scarred over. Others viewed it as a masterstroke of foresight, Queen Elizabeth passing on power not in titles or speeches, but through private, potent symbolism. Still, the debate persisted. Was this her quiet way of guiding the monarchy's compass one last time? Or had she, even in death, underestimated the pain that power disguised as inheritance could cause? One thing was clear. The gesture had changed the landscape. It reframed Beatrice, it silenced Sarah, and it reminded the world that even after her passing, the Queen was still orchestrating the future from behind the curtain. Yet, just as speculation began to cool, a single resurfaced letter reignited the entire controversy. Buried deep in the Queen's correspondence archives, a letter was uncovered written in her own hand, signed in her own ink. And with it came a truth that turned every assumption upside down. For weeks, the royal household had remained quiet. The firestorm had passed, the headlines had cooled. But just when the waters seemed calm, a tremor from the past rippled through Buckingham's corridors. The discovery was accidental, a footnote in an internal audit, tucked among pages of routine correspondence. But this was no ordinary letter. Addressed directly to Sarah Ferguson, it bore a date that made the palace flinch just 3 months before Queen Elizabeth's death. The timing alone was enough to shake everything loose. The letter was personal, warm, even tender. The Queen's tone was unmistakably affectionate, her words heavy with gratitude. She spoke of Sarah's years of quiet presence, of her commitment to the late Prince Philip's corgis, of her quiet loyalty even when the world and the royal family offered her none in return. Most notably, she referenced something personal left in trust, a phrase that sent legal scholars, royal historians, and every tabloid in London into a frenzy. Had the Queen intended to leave Sarah a piece of her private collection after all? Was there an unspoken promise, a final wish that had been overlooked, or worse, ignored? Questions poured in faster than answers could be buried. Could such a letter override the will? Did it even hold legal weight? Would it be seen as a personal sentiment or a formal directive? The divide was immediate. Some experts argued that emotional expression does not constitute legal instruction. Others insisted that in the context of royal protocol, where discretion outweighs documentation, such a letter could reveal the Queen's true intent more clearly than any clause. But for Sarah Ferguson, it wasn't a matter of legal standing. It was personal and deeply painful. According to sources close to her, she was devastated to learn of the letter's existence not through a call from the palace, but from a journalist's quiet tip. The betrayal wasn't just in what had been withheld, it was in how it was discovered. For Sarah, it reopened a wound that had only just begun to close. A wound made deeper by silence, sharper by the fact that the letter had existed all along, hidden in plain sight. And while the palace refused to issue any formal comment, insiders confirmed that senior aides were blindsided. Tension flared behind closed doors. Whispers swirled about who had leaked the letter, why it had surfaced now, and whether more private communications could follow. It was no longer a matter of inheritance, it had become a matter of truth, of trust, of legacy reshaped by something so small as paper and ink. And as the dust refuses to settle, one question lingers: will the jewelry remain a symbol of trust or a trigger for deeper division? In a family built on ceremony, discretion, and continuity, the Queen's private gift cracked the foundation. The jewels now sparkle with meaning, both of legacy fulfilled. What began as a quiet act of inheritance had become the monarchy's most whispered about rupture. The jewelry, nestled in its royal velvet casing, now carried not just gemstones, but a weight neither Princess Beatrice nor her mother could have anticipated. Though the palace made no official mention beyond initial acknowledgements, Beatrice's silence spoke volumes. She wore the inheritance with caution present, but never flaunted. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't celebration. It was something else. A signal of her new position in the family, forged not through public favor, but through private selection and private pain. Insiders say Beatrice refused to issue any public statement on the matter. Whether it was out of respect, fear, or sheer emotional exhaustion, no one could say. But behind closed doors, those close to her revealed that she was still grappling with the fallout, not just with the press or the court of public opinion, but with the deeper realization that her gain had come at the expense of something sacred. The quiet trust between mother and daughter. Inheritance is never just about what's passed down. It's also about what's taken away. Meanwhile, Sarah Ferguson disappeared from view. No press appearances, no public events. Her usual openness, her candid tone in interviews all vanished. In their place was a strategic silence, one that many interpreted as forced retreat. Yet her absence only amplified her presence. Social media flooded with sympathy. Supporters invoked her decades of struggle, her ostracization, her slow crawl back into royal relevance. In this narrative, the jewels didn't just go to Beatrice. They were taken from Sarah, and that wound cut deep. Inside the royal household, the strategy was clear. Say nothing. Let the press burn itself out. Let the family move forward. But the silence didn't repair what had fractured. If anything, it underscored it. Behind the gilded walls, aides and advisors were already asking quiet questions. What would this mean for future transitions? Would the monarch's personal effects now become a source of contest, emotion, even rebellion? Would every bequeathed object come with an echo of betrayal? And so, the fracture held. Small, symbolic, but dangerous. Because in a monarchy built not just on power but on perception, symbolism is everything. And nothing was more symbolic than the Queen's final, silent gesture. Some called it a brilliant move of foresight. Others, a cruel twist of favoritism. Either way, it was hers alone. No explanation, no apology. Just a shimmering reminder that even in death, Queen Elizabeth remained the most unpredictable player on the royal board. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.